Hi everyone and welcome to another Gaffer in Gear. Today's episode is a behind the scenes. So for this project, it's a short film, and the idea was to test out a volumetric studio to see what we could and couldn't achieve, and to see what lessons could be learnt from doing this short film before we do a real project in it. Alright, so before we get underway, I'd just like to do some thank yous. So the first thank you is to Simon Green, who is the director of the project and the director of photography, for number one, letting us look at bits of his film, and number two, letting us show his work as a cinematographer. I would also like to thank LED Studios, whose facilities we were filming in, for giving me access to BTS footage and allowing me to film for this episode. And LED Studios would also like to thank their business partners. Now, there are a lot of extraordinary images in this episode, which are the result of a lot of people's hard work. So at the end of the episode, I'm just going to roll the credits for the short film as well. Now for this project, the volume was configured into a 360-degree configuration with a massive LED ceiling. Now, if you're not familiar with a volumetric studio, it is hundreds, if not thousands, of LED screens all linked together to create a virtual environment. Now, this isn't just a big LED screen, it is a virtual environment. So these environments are pre-programmed in advance using something called Unreal Engine. I don't know a lot about that, but the big difference between this and just having a pretty picture up on the wall is that the environment reacts to the camera's movements. So if you pan your camera, for example, then the perspective on the wall is going to change to match the camera angle. For example, in this shot here that I've slowed down, you can see that there's a square on the wall. That square is what the camera is seeing, and everything in that square is augmented to suit the camera's perspective. Everything else not in that square is a low resolution render of the environment, and that low resolution render is important for things like reflections on the actor's costuming. This costume, for example, would be an absolute nightmare on a green screen shoot. The other advantage this also has over green screen is that your hair and makeup can be reflective. If you want reflections, you can have them. Now, all these reflections really help to sell that the actor is in the environment. Another advantage over green screen is you can have transparent clothing. Imagine trying to rotoscope this if it was green screen. And all those reflections really do sell it. Now, you don't have to worry about your props having a matte finish. They can be reflective as well. And you can have other elements like smoke, which you can't easily use in a green screen environment. Now, remember that big LED screen that's in the ceiling? It's fantastic for shooting downwards because you get reflections off the actors and the props that can give the impression that there is a massive set going above the camera. And you can also get reflections of the environment on water. Now, there are some disadvantages that this current technology has over, say, shooting on green screen. For example, on green screen, you can shoot high speed, whereas in the LED volumes, you're limited to the refresh rate of the screens. Now, we had a high speed shot in our story, so we ended up shooting this against black, with a lighting transition added for effect. The next advantage that I think green screen has is when it comes to shooting downwards. With a green screen, all you need is a floor that's painted green, whereas in a volumetric studio, you're going to need to build a set. The next advantage or disadvantage really depends on your clients. If you've got clients that can't make their mind up when they get to post-production, you can still change the background, whereas when you're shooting with this technology, what you've shot is the background you're stuck with. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the amount of light that's in the volumetric studio. So the volumetric studio itself does supply pretty much the bulk of your ambient light needs, particularly if you've got a 360-degree configuration like we had. Now, there is a big misperception, and that misperception is that you can take part of the walls and then turn those into virtual lights. So for example, if you've got a section of wall you're not shooting against, you could turn that into a 12 by 12 white light source. Now here's the thing you need to understand. These big volumetric LED walls are televisions. They're not film and television production lights. They are not RGBW or RGBWW. Being televisions, they are simply RGB. So as you can see, without broad spectrum white emitters or an overlapping amber, lime or cyan, there's quite a bit of missing spectrum here. This of course affects your color render. So as you can see, the color vector is quite a bit out of shape, and we only have a TM30 color vector score of 47. Now the thing for gaffers to really note is the CCT, 7,810 Kelvin. Now if you want to use another metric, the SSI score was 28. So while the LED volume screens do give you a fantastic overall ambience and can be used to give you matching colours and tones, I wouldn't use them as a key light on my leading actors. Alright, so let's talk about the shoot now, and one thing I really want to emphasise straight off is that the idea of this short film was so that we could go into a volumetric studio and learn from our mistakes, okay? See what works, see what doesn't work. And our learning curve at the start was like this. I mean, the first setup looked terrible. The big mistake I made was I went in with the wrong attitude. So what I'd heard through social media and the perception I had of working in a volumetric studio was that it is like doing a green screen shoot, except you don't have to light the green screen. So you're going to use hardly any equipment. So we went in there with the same approach as we'd have to lighting a green screen shoot, except without having to light the background. Now, if you take that approach to your lighting when you go in there, what you're going to end up with is a result that looks like a really bad green screen. And let me explain why. When you do a green screen shoot, let's say this hand here is our foreground and we've got a green screen behind us. They're two separate elements, okay? You're lighting up your foreground and the background doesn't exist. Then when you get into post-production, they add the background to the foreground. Now at that point, they're two separate elements, okay? So they can grade the foreground element so that it matches the background. So they can adjust the tones and the hues so that whatever it is that you shot on the green screen matches the background that they're putting in post. Now when you're shooting in a volumetric studio, that doesn't happen. You don't have two separate elements that you can adjust separately later on in post-production. It has to be adjusted there in camera. So when we went in there, we went in with cheaper options like bicolor lights instead of sky panels with octadones. So the initial problem we had when we had a look at our first lighting setup is the tonal value didn't match from the foreground to the background. It looked like a bad chroma key. So we thought, okay, this is no problem. What we're going to do is ask the guys in the volumetric studio to adjust the background so that it matches our foreground. Now, remember earlier in the video, I discussed that the background screens are only RGB. They're not RGBW or anything like that. Well, they don't have the ability to do fine-tune adjustments like that. So the only option we had left to get a good-looking image was to change all of the lights out and go with lights that had an extended CCT range and color tunability. That's something we could add a hue into so that we could grade our foreground images using our lights to match the background wall. Now, we didn't have time to do this on the first setup. The only full color light I could get in was the scratch or the kicker light from behind. And I tuned a bit of color into that to try and get some sort of connection between the foreground and the background, but it still looks like a really bad chroma key. Now, while they were filming that, I was trying to set up as many full color gamut lights as I could for the reverse shot. Now, here's the reverse. And as you can see, having full color gamut lights that enable me to dial in hues that are in the background has made a huge difference in matching the foreground to the background. So in this shot, her face is lit with light matte spectrums, and I've dialed in a color match to match what I would think would be the light bouncing back off the walls. Now, we also found that we could be braver because when you're doing a green screen, you never know. They could always change the background on you. But in this situation, the background is what's in camera. We know it's not going to change. So we can be braver with our shadows than we would be if we were doing a green screen. Now, if this was a green screen, for example, there's no way I would light the leading lady with this much shadow in her face. But because we are 100% certain of what the background is, we can do it if it matches. Okay, so let's have a look at that scene now, and remember that his key light and fill light are neutral, whereas her key light and fill light have a hue graded into them to see if that makes a difference. Now, again, I want to point out, we're learning from this process, so we still haven't got things right, like figuring out what the ideal distance the camera needs to be away from the wall is. So we're still figuring it out. Learning curve like that. Okay, let's take a look.
What did you find?
Nothing. It was empty.
Is that what you expected?
I guess inside I thought there might be a clue.
Like what?
Something. Something.
Alright, so let's talk about that battle scene. Now, the overall ambience in the room is supplied by the light coming off the LED volume. Now, bear in mind, you've also got that big LED screen over the top of us. Now, in order to match the coolness of the scene behind the actors, I'm running my key lights at 10,000 Kelvin. This is another example of why you need lights that you can color tune. Now, in this scene, I'm using a sky panel with an octadone as a key, as well as a light matte spectrum that I can move around for additional wrap. And as a fill light, we have a light matte spectrum running at 11,000 Kelvin. Now have a look at this for cool. We can position the virtual sun so that the shadows in the environment around the actors match the direction that we are key lighting from. Now, the control that you've got over this virtual environment is amazing. Not only can you position the sun where you want it, you can keep it in that position, so you're not chasing the sun around your set. You can have the conditions overcast, sunny, warmer, cooler. And in addition to that, you've got the big LED screen over the top. You can adjust the brightness of that. So you've got a virtual 12 by 12 anytime that you need it. For example, in this scene, they dialed down the sky so that we had a lot more mood in shot. This sequence is only lit with 2 light matte spectrums. So let's watch that battle scene again, but this time bear in mind that all of the lights used total 2 light matte spectrums, a sky panel through an octadone, and a sky panel doing a fire effect on some foreground. Now let's take a look at some of the next scene that we shot. So in the next sequence, we're starting to get the hang of how to shoot and how to light in the volumetric studio. Now the next sequence, the lights used total 2 sky panels with octadones and 4 light matte spectrums.
It could be that hunting to kill each other is not the solution either.
And action.
So when this environment came up on the LED volume, I just looked around and went, I don't even know where to start. So I had a bit of a chat to Simon about it, and Simon brought up something very interesting because he's the director and the DOP. So this virtual environment, it's a virtual set that's built in pre-production. All right, so Simon's knows that environment. He's walked through that environment. He's picked what color neon signs he wants. He's picked where he wants the street lights. So from a director of photography's perspective, with your virtual sets, you can change the color of your lights, you can dim the lights, you can position them where you want them positioned. So it's not just making decisions on set. You can get there in pre and have a walk through and change the environment to suit your lighting needs. So my approach after hearing that was, okay, I'm just going to take the aesthetic that's on the walls and bring that off the walls onto the actors. So if they're next to a big neon sign, that's what is going to be our key light. If they're not near a big neon sign or anything like that, then I'm going to match our key light, the color of our key light, to the street lighting in the environment. Now, the one thing I did learn from this scene is if you've got a light source in the back of shot that's on the LED wall, it doesn't project light the way a real street light would, for example, okay? Because the LED volume is a big soft light. It's not a hard light source. So if you've got environments like this where you've got light sources in shot that in the real world would supply a kick or supply a scratch onto the actor, you've got to figure out how you're going to do that. You've got to put that in your mind before you get onto set. Make sure you've got the right equipment. To give you a clearer explanation, let's take a look at this wide shot. So on the background behind her, there's a light source. Now I've put a light just above the shot on a C-stand arm, and that's supplying the kick or the scratch light that's on her. So she looks like she's part of that environment. Now on him, I've done a similar thing. There's a subtle amber light source there, and I've given him a subtle amber kick. So he feels like he's connected to the environment that's behind him. However, in the center, there's a whopping great big sign that is the brightest thing in shot, and the actors have no light coming off it because I didn't have a menace arm. I didn't have any way of getting a light source back there to come in over the top. So there are some reflections there on his jacket, some reflections of the light source, but there's no kicks like you'd get off a light source like that. But anyway, that's why we're doing this short film, so we can learn from the mistakes made in this project before we get on to another one. So, lesson learnt. Now, in terms of lighting this sequence, my key light was a 5-foot octadome with a sky panel behind it, and I had a light matte spectrum to wrap around and give us some eye light or catch light. And I colour tuned those in to match the neon lighting, which you can just make out here in the corner of the BTS. Now, in terms of my kick lights, I just took inspiration from what was in the background. So on this side, there's some sort of aqua, I don't know what color you'd call that. So I just dialed that in on my spectrums and put that in as the kick light on that side. And on the other side, it's a predominant yellow light source, so I dialed that in as my kick. Now on the BTS footage here, you can just make me out in the monitor doing the final adjustments for this shot.
You're clear there. And action.
I take the same approach with the close-up shots of the guns. Whatever is the predominant background colour is what I use as my kick.
It could be that hunting to kill each other is not the solution either.
After doing that cyberpunk scene, I was totally sold on this as opposed to doing green screen. From a lighting perspective, I am sitting in the finished product. You know, I can see where a light source needs to come from. I can see where to take my cues from. I can see what colors I've got to match to, whereas sitting in a green screen studio looking at someone's iPad with a picture of what's going to be on the background just doesn't give me those cues. You can really match it. And the other thing I love too is it's no secret I'm dyslexic. So when I'm doing green screen, and you do the reverse shot, that's easy. I know I just move the key to the other side, but I always get confused when you're doing those 3/4 back shots or whatever, and trying to figure out in my head where I am in the environment. That doesn't happen in this environment, in this virtual world, because the whole world turns around and you can see where you are instantly, and you can figure out where you need to put the lights. I absolutely love it. The only thing you've got to bear in mind is you are surrounded by LED screens, so it does get a bit warm in there. So sort of bear that in mind with what sort of liquids you take with you to set, because you're going to be quite thirsty working in there. But absolute pleasure to work in that environment as opposed to working a green screen. Now, as I said earlier, a lot of people are involved in making these images. So, I've predominantly just talked about myself and Simon, but you've got digital artists, all sorts of people, hair and makeup, sound design. So we're just going to roll the credits for the film.